wanted to say welcome to everyone, and thank you for being here at our ELI Corporate Forum. And as you know, many of you have been here for a number of years. This is an annual event for us, and we want to explore the unique and important role of companies in advancing environmental protection. And this one I don't have to read. I'm Ben Wilson, and I'm the chairman of the board of ELI. And our mission is to foster innovative, just, and practical law and policy solutions to enable leaders across borders and sectors to make environmental, economic, and social progress. Now, since 1969, ELI has played a pivotal role in shaping the fields of environmental law, policy, and management domestically and abroad. We are internationally recognized nonpartisan research and education center working to strengthen environmental protection by improving law and governance worldwide. And this forum continues ELI's recent exploration of federal-state relationship aimed at identifying law and policy solutions for optimizing government roles going forward. This effort, which we have entitled the Macbeth Dialogues, is a partnership with ECOS, and that has the support of the American College of Environmental Lawyers. It's undertaken in honor and memory of a great friend of ELI and many of us, Angus Macbeth. The starting point for the dialogues is Cooperative Federalism 2.0, a document put out by ECOS this past June, and our own Alex is right here, and she can tell us more about that. An initial Chatham House Rule gathering was held this summer that convened experts and key stakeholders. And in the last few weeks, we've conducted a broader survey on this topic, and that was sent out far and wide to get the input of multiple stakeholders. If you haven't received the survey, just by a show of hands, who hasn't received the survey? Raise them high, let us know, and we will be sure to get that to you. Thank you. And we want to hear your views. In the coming months, ELI will put out a policy paper that synthesizes today's exchange and other ideas that are being shared through the Macbeth Dialogues. Now, based on the input to date, we think there may be room for consensus among the following ideas. First, the idea of moving environmental protection in the direction of an environmental protection enterprise, with the public and private sector both having important roles to play. The notion that interstate dimensions still matter and warrant greater federal attention than intrastate issues is important. That consistency in implementation remains important as a means of ensuring fairness among states and a level playing field for business, but that greater state flexibility in implementation should be possible without compromising the goal of overall consistency. That when a state can do as good a job or better perhaps than the feds, that the feds should stand down, consistent with the principle of subsidiarity. The agreement may be possible, that agreement may be possible around an audit approach that can serve as a primary system for federal oversight of delegated programs in lieu of routine case-by-case review and intervention. I know many are interested in hearing more about that. And of course, I think we're all very much aware that a lot of the power is shifted to market forces and consumers, with private environmental governance mechanisms increasingly driving beyond compliance behaviors without the interviewing hand of government. So this last point is of particular importance, of course, to ELI. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our friend Cassie Phillips. She's going to tell us about the initiative she's spearheading at ELI focused on private environmental governance. She's going to identify the biggest opportunities and most pressing challenges facing the use of voluntary standards, eco-labels, and other market mechanisms to promote environmental stewardship. And I think many of you know, but I'll tell you that Cassie's negotiated a number of complex multi-stakeholder environmental agreements implemented through voluntary means. She's an expert on the law and policy issues associated with voluntary standards. And prior to ELI, Cassie was Vice President of Sustainable Forestry at Weyerhaeuser And prior to that, she worked as an attorney in private practice and as a key advisor for the U.S. Senate. We're thrilled to have Cassie. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. And thank you, everyone. And I don't want to get between you and the panel too much because we've got a terrific panel here, but it's a chance to introduce you a little bit to a new program at ELI. It's called Private Environmental Governance, and I'm directing it. And as Ben mentioned, private environmental governance is the world of voluntary standards, both formal and informal. And most of you work in businesses. That's the purpose of the corporate forum. And I'm confident that every business in this room has got some interaction with a voluntary standard or other initiative. They fit very nicely with the topic the panel is talking about today and the topic that's been the subject of the Macbeth Dialogues, which is cooperative federalism, or how to integrate the relationship between different levels of government, and then I would throw in, and also the world of voluntary standards. Now, I hate to be the skunk at the picnic, and I know everyone should be very positive about the idea that companies do voluntary standards to go above and beyond the law and to have a green reputation and maybe even a premium. But it's not really, the world of standards and PEG is not really that simple. And the fundamental question of whether you can use a standard or whether a standard or a voluntary program fits into a system of just compliance with the law, mere compliance with the law, is a really important question. I have had a lot of experience in voluntary standards, and in my experience, just that question of can we get through, say, a ISO 14001 environmental management system, a commitment to that, or similar programs, audited programs, can we get consistent compliance with environmental laws and standards at an international level, is a huge boon to the environment and a huge boon to business. Companies, especially U.S. companies, are often attracted to standards because they give them the opportunity to think about raising the bar on international competitors. But that raises challenging questions because you can't just say, oh, well, you have to comply with the law, because some laws in some countries exist on paper but are not enforced because of high levels of corruption or other issues. Or they may even have excessive laws that shouldn't be enforced but are called out occasionally for corruption purposes. And so coming up with consistent definitions, but then actually holding everybody accountable for meeting them can make a huge difference. And a couple of examples, the American Chemistry Council's Responsible Care Program, environmental management system that requires, in part, consistent legal compliance internationally. I'm confident has made a difference. In my world in forestry, a good example is the Brazilian pulp industry. The Brazilian pulp industry is based on planted eucalyptus forests, not in the tropics, and very different ecosystems and different industry than tropical forestry. They were able to differentiate themselves by agreeing to voluntary standards and meeting a high level of legal compliance, which then lets them give access to markets internationally that are very different than their counterparts still managing tropical forests, which is a whole different industry. But that whole question is really important. And so that then leads to the policy and legal questions of, well, how does a regulatory system take account of and give credit to a voluntary standard implementation of legal requirements through that? And the flip side is, how does a voluntary standard take into account the existence of legal requirements? And those are very challenging questions and very important ones. And I could talk all day about them, but I am introducing people, so I'm gonna skip the details. I would love to go into that, and maybe I'll just turn them all into questions that I'll ask the panelists. Instead, I'd like to turn this subject over to a very able panel and moderator, Alex Dunn. And Alex is the executive director and general counsel of the I'm going to get the name wrong here. The Environmental Council of the States. And the Environmental Council of the States, ECOS, is an organization of the state environmental directors and state and federal environmental leaders. It's nonpartisan. It's been around a long time, and they have there's nobody better to tackle this question than the integration of state and federal requirements and then throw in voluntary standards to boot. So with that, I'll defer to Alex.
Great, thank you, Cassie. And it's so nice to see you all here on one of, I think, our most perfect early fall days. I hope that you all didn't come just to make sure you would get the best entry and place at the bar for the reception tonight. I know that there is some enthusiasm for that. Hopefully you're here for what I hope will be a really good discussion, and I know I'm really thrilled to be up here with this great panel. Before I introduce the panel, I'll maybe pick up where Cassie and Ben started, which is we are at a pivotal moment in looking at our system of environmental protection in our country. The administration has arrived. The president has strong views about the role of the EPA. His EPA administrator, Scott Pruitt, has very strong views about the role of the federal EPA and about the states. And so as you heard about ECOS, and I have two of my ECOS leaders with me on this panel here, Todd Parfit and Martha Rudolph at the far end, and I'll introduce them in a moment. The states have been thinking a lot about what this new dynamic might mean for implementation of environmental protection. And really, as we've been thinking about it, not just the states, but with other bright minds, is that we need a system of environmental protection that doesn't rely on just one party, the federal government or the state government or citizen suits or the private entities or some third-party pressure to make results. We need a system, I think of it as like pulling a wagon, a very heavy wagon. The public expects clean air, clean water, beautiful forests to hike in and to have access to. And if we want to provide those things to the public, no one party can pull that wagon alone. And I think we all know that. And so the idea is, and this conversation today, talking about private environmental governance, is to explore one of those particular parties that can help us pull and deliver the clean and healthy environment that people want, and that is the corporate sector. I actually started my career, my second job was at American Chemistry Council. In fact, the person who hired me is back there, Jamie Conrad. Thank you, Jamie, for hiring me that day. Because I was at American Chemistry Council right after Responsible Care had been launched. And so I got to see what it was like in the early days of corporate environmental standards and how companies were starting to use these codes of conduct to run defensive plays, to run offensive plays, to brand themselves with their competitors, to distinguish themselves in the marketplace. And then as we fast forwarded into Republican administration, there were talk about could some of these stellar actors, the A students in the classroom, might they be entitled to less oversight? Would those programs, those certification programs, those compliance standards allow perhaps a regulator with limited resources to turn his or her attention to another party in the system? And we tried things like that. Some of you might remember Project XL and some of the other, walk down memory lane. We have toyed with these concepts for a long time about what is the role of the private environmental governance system, and most specifically for today's discussion, how can we use private environmental governance as a collective society to change how we deliver environmental protection? And is it an add-on? Is it the dessert after a meal that you can take or not take? Or is it part of the main course of delivering the protection? So that's what we want you to think about today. Because frankly, as we look, the Senate was supposed to vote this week on the EPA budget. It's deferred. One of the, Senator Cochran is in the hospital, couldn't be back for the vote, so they've rescheduled. But we know that the amount of resources that our federal government plans to invest in the US EPA and the states has stayed flat And there's a potential, depending on how politics go, of it declining. So does that mean that we should look at private environmental governance in a different way and take more advantage of what it has to bring? And then how do we build the credibility, the trust, the allowing the public to take it as an acceptable substitute, if we want that, for traditional regulation? So on this panel, we have just the right mix of people to kick this off, and then we, of course, want to involve all of you. So to my right is Richard DeSanti. I'm not going to read their bios in all detail because these are amazing people and we will never finish. But I'll give you some highlights, and if I left out your favorite highlight, you just chime it in. But Richard is with Chevron. He is the Chief Environment and Safety Counsel in the Environment and Safety Law Group in the Chevron Corporation Law Department. I think right there we have established that he is an appropriate person to be on this panel. He leads a 26-lawyer environment safety law group that provides advice across Chevron's businesses, both in the US and worldwide. And I think that global component is something that we're going to want to touch on, because that is part of environmental governance. It's not just domestic. There's also other forces outside of these 50 states. He has a wonderful background. He is an attorney, as you can imagine, and he also was able to pursue his JD at the same time that he was pursuing a master's from the Kennedy School at Harvard, and his bachelor's is from Boston University. So welcome, Richard. Moving down our panel here, to Richard's right is Janet Peace. Hello, Janet. She is the Senior Vice President for Policy and Business Strategy at the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, some of us fondly refer to as C2ES. And C2ES is the largest US-based association of companies devoted to climate policy and corporate strategies. So once again, a very good person to be on this panel. Janet specifically works with the Business Environmental Leadership Council, and that is mainly Fortune 500 companies with combined revenues of over $2 trillion and more than 3.5 million employees. So lots of people to pull the wagon in that statistic. So we look forward to having Janet on this panel. Janet has her doctorate and Master of Science in Economics and an undergraduate degree in geology, and there's much more, but I'm going to leave you to ask for that later. Okay, to Janet's right. Our next wonderful speaker is John Lovenberg, Vice President for Environmental for BNSF Railway. Another great company that's almost a household name. Anyone who had a little boy at some point might have had a few trains. I did, and yes, so we like what you do. BNSF Railway is a Berkshire Hathaway company. It operates in 28 states and 2 Canadian provinces on 32,000 miles of track. They have 40,000 employees and over $20 billion in annual revenues. So again, he really brings not only the domestic but also the global perspective, working with our North American neighbor, Canada, also working in so many states. So you've had a chance probably, like Chevron, to see the compare and contrast between different states and how they might approach private environmental governance. And then we will introduce you to our 2 state environmental regulators. To John's right is Martha Rudolph. She is the Director of Environmental Programs at the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment. She serves as the Director of all environmental programs for the department: air, water, hazardous materials, environmental health, and sustainability. She is also an environmental attorney and previously spent 14 years with the Colorado Attorney General's office and has been in private practice. And perhaps my favorite part of her resume is that she is a past president of ECOS, having just finished her term as past president. So I've had the pleasure of working with Martha for many years. And then following on Martha's heels is Todd Parfit, who is the director of the Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality. Thanks for coming all the way from Wyoming. The governor of Wyoming, Matt Mead, appointed Todd the director of Wyoming DEQ in 2012. He previously served as the deputy director and head of the industrial siting division prior to his appointment, and he has also been in private environmental consulting. Todd currently serves as the ECOS president and was just ascended to that position, having been elected vice president at our fall meeting just a few weeks ago. So we've got a great group of people here, and I'm going to just kick it off with a question that I think will at least start by going down the line, but then we're going to shake it up, and we won't necessarily do down the line every time. So for each of you, when you've heard Cassie talk about private environmental governance and how she frames it, you've heard me frame it in a way. When you hear private environmental governance in your role, sitting from your vantage point at Chevron, what do you think of, Richard?
I think of engaging and harnessing things like environmental management systems to enable compliance, to assure compliance. I also can't help but think, as soon as you raise that concept about issues of sustainability, and my concern, we talked about a little bit about this before, that if you take our current system of environmental governance in the U.S. and try to think about it 50, 100 years from now, and just extend out the current trends, we have right now 35,000 pages of environmental rules in the Federal Register. It's twice the size of the federal tax code. Most people think the tax code is pretty complex. You extend that out over, pick your time frame, it just becomes an unsustainable burden. You add that to changes in the workforce, young workers coming in who think email is too long and complex and want to do everything with instant messages. And you try to marry those two trends together, it just doesn't work. And so it kind of comes to me that you have to think about private environmental governance. So to your point about is it the dessert, is it part of the entree, I think it's got to be part of every course in the menu.
Oh, I like that. Great. Janet?
That's a good analogy. So I come at this from two different vantage points. I come at this from somebody who's worked on policy, environmental policy, for more decades than I care to admit, and from somebody who's worked with companies, as you all heard. And I think that private engagement and corporate involvement in policy is critical from a lot of different angles. There's a lot of benefits of having companies at the table, a lot of experience. It can increase the flexibility for government and industry both. It can help you do some pilots and try some new things that you might not have thought of that can help you in the long haul. I think that there's a lot of important positive attributes of having companies involved in this. But I also worry a little bit that there could be too much emphasis on just having corporate self-regulation, if that's the right word. I think you get a problem of some self-selection. Companies that are really leaders, they step up to the front, and some who aren't leaders can step to the back, and you end up with a focus on the leaders, and you forget about some in the back end there. So you could shift your focus from the worst to the best, which isn't always good. It's not good for leaders especially. I think there's also, there's a danger that you rely on kind of a corporate average baseline, if you will, and you might not get that level of innovation that you might from more of a pulling regulation or a set of subsidies that would push that kind of innovation into the market. So there's a lot of pluses, but I think there's also a role for government, I'll just say that. There's a role for both. So part of all the courses, is that how you said? Okay, we'll go with that.
Mm-hmm. And John, what are your thoughts?
Sure. So for corporate governance, so maybe take that internally and externally. So we do a lot of benchmarking. And I would say our system starts with environmental and safety stewardship culture. That's sort of the bedrock of where we start. And we layer on enterprise risk management systems and then sustainable solutions on top of that. So we can get into a lot more detail, but let me build on what Richard was saying about the the management system. So our management system, we have close to 1,000 permits at our facilities. So not an easy task to manage that volume of facility permits. So having a good environmental management information system to help you stay on top of all those permits is important. Having a continuous improvement system, so that means having some best practices, having an environmental audit system, a continuous improvement system, I think is part of having a good, solid, sound environmental management system. That's sort of our internal system to get better and better. From an external standpoint, part of good governance is having good partners. That's original equipment manufacturers, it's agencies, it's non-governmental organizations. C2ES, we're a member of the Global Logistics Emission Council, which is a global group looking at carbon footprints across the transportation chain. So Alex, you were mentioning global pieces. Our customers, we have thousands of customers that were moving their freight, and they're operating globally. So trying to get that information and integrate carbon emissions across the full global supply chain is part of what we do externally. So that's just kind of an overall summary of our philosophy around governance.
Excellent. And then we have our regulators who interface with private environmental governance in probably a very different way than our first three speakers.
So a couple of thoughts that I have on this. Really, in listening to all the other speakers, you're really looking at how do you ensure compliance with the minimum regulatory requirements, and how do you reward or recognize achievement that goes above the minimum environmental regulations that are out there. And so that's really kind of in my view, sort of, they go hand in hand. You want to make sure that there's accountability, that you have a way of trusting but verifying that companies that say that they are environmental leaders are really environmental leaders. Because I'll be really just upfront. Every company out there says, I care about the environment, I care about public health. We've got all these programs in place to ensure that our company is up on top of things and is really in compliance. They all say that. They don't all do that. I mean, that's just a fact. So what I think you look at is it really has to be part of the company's ethos. It really has to be something that is embedded in the systems. And we're talking about EMS systems, but it has to be embedded in the systems. And from my perspective, every large entity has a hard time getting the desires and the direction of the leaders down into the field, down to where it really counts, the staff that really implements the programs. We have issues with that in my department. It's not, I'm sure it's the case, having been in private practice and been in-house, it certainly isn't the case in companies. And so you really need to make it part of the management systems that go all the way down in the company, that make it part of that employee's responsibilities, that they'll be evaluated on not just how many widgets did they get out the door, but how did they comply with the environmental requirements, and maybe a rise above that depending on the particular company. How did they achieve those environmental goals? That individual employee achieve the environmental goals. Make it as much a responsibility of the employee to achieve that as it is to get the number of widgets out the door. I think that's what's really, from my perspective, important to see that, to really see how it is embedded within the company. Because it is the case that as budgets get tighter, as requirements get more stringent and there's more of them, you have to develop a means of trusting, building the relationship and trusting the companies that you're looking at to do the right thing so that you can focus on those companies or those entities that are struggling more to come into compliance. So I'll just leave it at that.
Great. And then Todd.
All right, well, picking up from where Martha just left off, she mentioned the budget and the resources that the agencies have to deal with, and we all realize that we're facing tighter times in terms of budgets and so forth, and so we need to look at innovative ways to get to the outcomes that we all want. And so what's the most efficient way to deliver that service? And it's important for the states and the federal agencies to embrace the idea of innovations. And I think that's a real important concept. And not that that hasn't been adopted or incorporated already. For example, in Wyoming, we have a self-audit program, which it has been used and is very beneficial to companies to identify where they may have shortcomings from compliance with environmental rules, but allows them to get back into compliance through that self-audit program without penalty or repercussions. We're working on information technology, environmental permitting, environmental reporting, making things easier for the regulated community, easier for the states in terms of how we manage that data, and making the data relevant. Oftentimes you see programs where we may have been collecting data for years and years and years, and somebody asks, why are we collecting that data? And nobody really has a good idea, and it's not being utilized in the way maybe that it was intended originally. So there's that. Now Martha touched on the trust issue. And I think anytime you set up these innovative programs, you have to ensure that there's trust by EPA trusting the states, because the states have primacy for these programs, and EPA plays an oversight role. The states have to trust the regulated community, and vice versa. The regulated community has to trust that the states will honor whatever programs that are established. But the most important one on the trust issue is the public trust. There's a public expectation that we achieve the outcomes that we all set out to achieve in terms of protecting the environment and public health. And that's in the public interest. And that's key because I think we can all envision where that trust is lost or violated. It only takes one instance, and that affects the entire universe of the regulated community moving forward. And then the last thing I'll mention is, it's a matter of keeping things simple. It's real easy to get requirements to get very complicated, but keeping it simple, and it was mentioned that there are 35,000 pages of rules that we have to deal with. We had an initiative in Wyoming that we had to, we were directed to look at our rules and reduce them by a third. And you'll be surprised that it seemed like a daunting task, but there are a lot of redundancies in existing rules, and finding those redundancies and making the requirements simpler will help with compliance rates.
Great. So I think we've established through this initial conversation that private environmental governance is valuable. It's a part of every course at the table. So one of the questions is, when we hear about the resources, as Todd mentioned, is do you have examples or can you share an experience where private environmental governance actually supplanted or freed up the resources of a regulator? Where did the private system enable, maybe it was in presenting information to a state agency, whether it was an audit or disclosure, where the private environmental governance system resulted in a lifting of a burden off a stretched regulator? That's for anyone.
I maybe have an example. So one of the things that we've done the last 2 years, we do a lot of permitting. I think we get maybe 300 wetlands permits per year on the railroad on average. And so one of the things we've done is we've built some GIS tools. There are a lot of great federal databases for doing NEPA permitting. And what we've done, we've worked with ESRI, the software vendor for GIS. We've imported all the federal databases into a single format to overlay them with our tracks and our projects. What that allows us to do is to do siting at the same time we do permit constraint analysis. So if I'm putting in a siting on a railroad track, I might tell the designers, why don't you put the siting on that side rather than putting it in the wetland, and then we just avoided having an impact. So what we've done with this GIS tool is, in working with the Corps and EPA in the states, is we'll share that information from the GIS databases. We're saying this is not our databases, these are all federal databases, endangered species, wetlands, tribal lands, land use information. So we see that as a good way for us to play a facilitating role in helping provide information that's publicly available information to facilitate the permitting process.
So
That's one of the ways we do that from a permitting standpoint, is leveraging geographic information systems, public databases in that dialogue.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating because you're sort of harmonizing information that might be available to the state regulator if they had the time to go check 6 different sources of federal information and then have the technology capability to, as you said, overlay those layers.
Right.
So you can bring something in that's a step ahead. And then I guess from a credibility standpoint, we've talked a lot about trust and accountability for our regulators. If a company's relying on publicly available government data, does that put you in a better place?
Yeah, I think it would. It certainly does, and I guess I was going to mention something that actually sort of dovetails to this, which is the innovations that technology brings, or that the capabilities to bring all that data together to then share with a government or with the public at large. I think is really where this needs to go in many respects. An example I was going to raise in Colorado, we started using IR cameras, infrared cameras. It's not a new technology, it's a relatively new technology, but it's really not that new. What IR cameras do, for those who don't know IR cameras, they allow the viewer to see emissions coming from a valve, from a smokestack, from whatever you're pointing the camera at. It doesn't quantify, it doesn't speciate, meaning it doesn't tell you what the emission actually is, but it does show you emissions. What this has done is it's enabled us as in the inspectors to go out to oil and gas facilities in particular and do an inspection and very quickly see where there are issues. But more importantly, the industry itself has been using IR cameras on their own to detect leaks that they can just go out with a wrench and shut it down. And so when we get reports of that, and when we go out and inspect, we also see much greater compliance with our requirements regarding leak detection and repair than we ever have before. And so I think technology can assist both the regulated community and the regulators, as well as provide valuable information to the public at large regarding the status of compliance, or just how is this particular facility operating? Are they in good stead? So I think innovation and technology can also be a great assistance to everyone that's involved in the regulation of environmental and just promoting good public health and environmental outcomes.
Janet?
Yeah, mine is a little bit of a different example. There was a recent effort by the Financial Stability Board, put together a corporate task force on what you should be disclosing in your financial statements about climate risks. And it was all corporate-led, and they came out with some significant guidance on how you should report on your overarching governance of the issue, how you should report on what your strategy is, what kind of metrics you should be reporting on. And I think that's helpful for industry. I think it's helpful for the public who's actually looking for that kind of information. I mean, right now we've got some pretty generic guidance that SEC's put out there, and I can tell you, having looked at some of these reports, you get one sentence that says, yep, not material, and you'll get another one that's 6 pages of just a whole bunch of stuff that's not really relevant. So, I mean, that 6 pages took somebody a lot of time to create all that material. So give me some guidance about what it is that we should be thinking about. And it's not just important for the SEC rules, it's also important to have this well over 200 different platforms for disclosing this kind of information. And I can tell you that some of the companies I work with have 2 or 3 people that that's all they do all the time is work on those disclosure reports. So some consistency across those reports about what's being asked, how it's being asked, how you're actually being able to report it, I think that's helpful. So it's helpful for stakeholders, it's helpful for industry, and in the end, it's going to be helpful for regulators when they look at, well, what should be in these financial reforms.
You're making me think that private environmental governance, you could just keep adding on to it, especially if you have a large company, they have limited resources, but resources, you keep adding on, but if the add-on has no value, then private environmental governance just becomes background noise, right? So you want it to be something where it's meaningful, where it helps
Useful.
people make decisions, it helps regulators, it helps the public. So let me turn to Richard, and you don't have to directly, you can riff off the direction we've been going, but I'm sure you have some thoughts.
Yeah, the only thing I'll say that I agree with you completely. It's got to add value. You know, you can spend a lot of time on an environmental management system and not get great results, but you can also spend a lot of time and get great results. And question is, the art is how you do that.
So one of the things that Janet, you mentioned earlier, which is whether private environmental governance maybe you were suggesting this, that it may lower the bar in some way, that everybody out there says, oh, this is now the standard, this is what we do, this is what good companies do.
replacement.
And that instead, do we want to see regulations that pull forward progress, or you mentioned subsidies that incentivize progress, and we've been talking a little bit about innovation. So I'd love to explore that with some of you. That is it your sense that private environmental governance becomes like a club that actually disincentivizes forward progress?
It could be. I mean, there's quite a bit of empirical evidence that says that regulatory pressure strongly and specifically influence the decision of many firms, especially as they think about moving forward with voluntary and joining voluntary programs. And there's quite a large body of evidence that you need both. Especially if you have a big issue that you want to deal with, like climate change. You need some either regulation, policy, you need some type of pricing mechanism that's going to both pull and push those really innovative technologies into the marketplace. I mean, you have a danger that you've got these really leading companies who are going to put a lot on the line to come in with this new technology, and nobody's going to want it. So you need a levelized playing field for companies that really want to be leaders, and the ones who actually want to stand at the back don't just get to take advantage of that.
Others?
Sure, I'll jump in here. When you look at innovation and creating incentives for those innovations, one of the things that we've explored is having on and off ramps. For example, the frequency of monitoring. It may make sense to say, look, well, if you meet these certain criteria, we'll allow a less frequent monitoring, which there's an incentive to the company up front. But the incentive to maintain compliance is that if you fall out of compliance, then you go back to the more frequent level of monitoring. So just kind of building in those incentives tied to frequency, which can have actually quite significant savings. I also wanted to add one other example, which is and something that we've worked with, is if you have, for example, an oil field, and they have a large number of spills throughout the course of the year, but they have a finite budget to address their infrastructure. And we've actually had programs where we've sat down with the company, identified where their most frequent events occur from spills, and then have them focus their limited resources in updating the infrastructure in those areas. Not that they don't address the other spills, but eventually you'll build out the whole infrastructure, but you do it in a more environmentally protective manner, but just by being innovative on how you approach the issue.
So that's sort of an example of the regulator, and I'm going to turn this one to Richard, because I wonder how you would feel if you went into a meeting with a state regulator and they said, well, Chevron, here's where we'd like you to invest in your infrastructure over the next couple of months. It strikes me that you might have other plans.
We might, but I would hope that we would have done the kind of analysis you're talking about. You know, that is optimizing if you have a limited amount of resources to bring to bear to a problem, you know, where can you do it best? And, you know, if there are companies that don't have that mindset or need help with implementing it, I think to the extent that regulators can help that, I think that's great. I also think there's we've been, to some extent, mixing two streams here. One question is incentivizing good behavior that's beyond regulatory requirements. And that's a piece of private governance. There's another stream that is more of the, a little bit of what we heard from our state regulator friends of, how do you manage limited budgets? Or from my perspective, how do you manage the world of 35,000 pages of things to comply with? And I have to add that it's not just 35,000 pages, it's 35,000 pages where you can almost pick a paragraph at random and three lawyers can debate for 2 hours what that paragraph means. So it's, a real level of complexity and difficulty in compliance. So, a whole nother, somebody used the phrase mere compliance. Well, if your job is compliance, as ensuring compliance with that 35,000 pages, plus the state stuff on top of that, that's not mere. That's a big job. And it's a big job for the regulators to comprehend and implement their side of the equation of assisting compliance and ensuring enforcement of all those pages. So there's a piece of environmental compliance separate from the going beyond that is the how do we simplify and manage that whole compliance issue and maybe allow regulators to focus their resources where they can do the most good.
Well, sort of you have to take care of, the baseline compliance before you can really be about, look at our water reduction and our global target for this or that.
Right.
That may be sort of smoke and mirrors if it's detracting from a company that is in its basic day-to-day operations having some compliance problems. All of that window dressing doesn't really get away from
Right.
the compliance issues. I'm going to turn it to John, and again, feel free to riff and ride the waves here.
Sure. Two things come to mind. I mean, I just maybe riffing off the state agency lead colleagues here, Todd and Martha here. So from a one perspective on regulations is looking at more of a performance-based regulation approach. And I think that gets at some of the streamlining. If you get to a little bit less prescriptive and a little bit more visionary and, what's the path you're going directionally, I think that's one way you can get simpler regulation. I think the other thing that it enables is leveraging technology. So I'll give you a good example. This is not an environmental regulation example, but on the railroad, we've spent a lot of time installing sensors. So we have ground penetrating radar, we have infrared, there's acoustic sensors, thermal sensors, and we get millions of readings a day, and we have a couple dozen data scientists that will crunch that data and use that information for proactive maintenance of the railroad. So trying to drive down any kind of risk issues. Separately, we have a whole prescriptive regime that's a very manual, go in the field, visually look at the things. We're using drones, advanced sensors, big data. We are, eons beyond some of the very prescriptive safety regulations. It's in our best interest to be safe, to not have a derailment, all those issues. So if you had more of a prescriptive, a performance-based standard that said, we want you to be safe and get safer, we'd be leveraging all that innovation without also having to do all the redundant prescriptive things that aren't really adding any value at this point, given how far the technology has come. So that performance-based regulations is one of the threads I think that we'd probably get a lot of common ground from the panel here.
Yeah, I'd jump right in, Martha.
So, thank you for that. Let's talk about 2.0, cooperative federalism. So, I think you're hitting on an issue that the states collectively are very interested in looking at, and that is to come up with more flexible ways of assuring the outcomes that we're after in protecting public health, enhancing the environment. How can we do this in a way that is measurable and actually allows those goals to be achieved without the checkbox, have I done all the things that historically perhaps had to be done when the environmental programs were new and nobody quite really knew how to implement them or where the flexibility should be or how, we just didn't know. And now I think the states have become much more sophisticated. By and large, industry and companies have become much more sophisticated as well. And I think recognize that we need to protect the public health, we need to protect the environment. How can we do it in a way that achieves sort of collectively those goals? And that's what we're talking about in this cooperative federalism, is allowing the flexibility so that you're not just making sure that you're complying with the requirements, but let's look at the requirements themselves. Are all of them actually something that achieves the ultimate goal, the metrics that we're trying to measure and we're trying to get to? And so thank you for setting that up, but I think that's exactly where the conversation really needs to go forward, is let's get away from the checking the boxes and the silos. The other thing that I think that we see as regulators, and probably the regulated community sees as well, is how the programs are siloed. And yet, what you do in one program, hazardous waste, may have a profound impact on the water quality program. And shouldn't you try to figure out how to make them work together in a way that really achieves the ultimate goal of protecting health and the environment, rather than, okay, we're going to make sure that these hazardous materials are dealt with this way and the water quality is protected that way. We should look at things more holistically.
Wow, I see heads nodding, so maybe a good old-fashioned amen to that. So looking at things holistically is, I think, exactly how many companies work, right? You look at the big picture, and then there's the micro processes. I think a lot of the public takes comfort in the micro processes. They take comfort in every box getting checked and every notice being filed and so how do you say to the consumer of the clean and healthy environment out there, which includes all of us in this room, don't ask us how we got there, just be glad we got there. We got there. We achieved the goal. We achieved the net ton reduction. Any thoughts on how to build the credibility?
Well, I guess the other thing I was going to cover is just part of I was describing our governance around sustainable solutions. That really is the integrating function. And I'll give you a good example for the railroad. So we burn about 1.3 billion gallons of diesel per year. So very sizable now. And that would be triple if it was moved by truck. So there's my commercial. So fuel efficiency, we've doubled our fuel efficiency in 30 years. So, that would have been 2.6 billion gallons. And for us, fuel efficiency is also greenhouse gas efficiency. So you can figure out if I'm getting 1% efficiency per year, I just saved 13 million gallons. I'm using fewer resources. I've got lower greenhouse gas emissions. I've got lower particulate and NOx emissions. I've got a lot of win-wins there. So it's a very compelling and easy internal business-focused driver, and it also has a lot of co-environmental benefits. So that's an easy place where you say, well, I'm going to try and turn the screws on John. It's like, well, you don't need to turn the screws on me on those. I mean, it's in my business interest from a cost, from a greenhouse gas, from a social license, all those aspects. So trying to find those sustainability sweet spots in every organization is part of helping business and get that traction and driving environmental stewardship.
How about Richard? Are you thinking about any business sweet spots? Sustainability sweet spots, is that what they were?
Now, let me riff in a different direction.
You go.
When you said the public likes to have the boxes checked rather than the results, I think you have to be careful or maybe more nuanced talking about the public.
Good.
So certainly, if a particular community, let's say, is opposed to a particular permit or a particular project, yes, they're going to look to see that every box was checked because that's what they want to see. I think when you talk about the public generally, the millions of Americans, I think they're more interested and you talk about the whole country or their state, I think they're more interested in the results and not in the check the box. I'd be interested in particularly what some of the state regulators feel about that. So it's, are you concerned about the project, a particular project? Yes, then I think you're check the box. If it's, are you concerned about environmental quality? I think it's more the end product. And if we check all the boxes, but we don't improve environmental quality, I don't think the public's going to accept that.
Right, there's a disconnect then.
And I think there's also a bit of a disconnect in that, I haven't seen the statistics in the last few years. I would be thrilled if someone could tell me this has changed, but I don't think it has. There used to be surveys about environmental quality, kind of nationwide surveys, and people would, year after year, put, deteriorating air quality as a major concern when Americans are breathing air that is cleaner than they've ever breathed in the lives of anyone here. We don't, somehow, all the incredible environmental progress that's been made, with lots of effort by regulators, by regulated entities, by everyone, lots of money, somehow that isn't coming across to the public. And I don't think you're going to make huge progress in either private environmental governance or decreasing complexity of regulation or anything else until you get a better understanding by the public of all the benefits that have been achieved. You can still say there's way more to be done, but I think there is less acknowledgement of the road that's been traveled than there
great.
probably should be.
Great point. So Janet and Todd, in either order.
I think that's really interesting. I teach a class on environmental policy, and I often bring up to the students, do you know that we have more forest cover today? Do you know that air is cleaner? Do you know and most of them don't.
Yeah.
So I think that's an interesting perspective, that you do have to realize that we have made a lot of progress. And I also want to riff off a little bit of what Martha said, which is the give people the road, tell them what you need, and let them figure out how to get there. I think that gives companies a lot of flexibility because there's a lot of different innovations that you could put on. And I'm thinking in particular about greenhouse gases. So telling people what the long-term goal is, and then this is how we're going to, you go ahead and you figure out how to get there. And we have a lot of experience with market mechanisms, and there's a lot of different ways to do that to give people the right incentive to move in that direction. If you've got a large investment that's a 30-year capital facility that you're going to be putting into the ground, you want to know what that policy is going to look like over that life of that. And you want to have some assurance before you're going to invest that money. So giving people an indication of what's going to be expected, I think, is really important.
Yeah, so on the issue of the check boxes and the silo, and I have to agree with what Martha was saying, is sometimes we do get into these silos, and I always enjoy the phone calls that I get from the company, because in a week they got a visit from the air quality folks, from the water quality folks, and from the solid and hazardous waste folks, but all on different days. Can we do a better job of coordinating that for the company and for the agency to be a little more efficient with the work we do? And I would tend to agree. But the two words that come to my mind when I start thinking about this idea of you've got the general public, and then you've got this subset of the public that may have a more focused awareness of the environmental programs that we have. And it comes down back to, for me anyway, trust and relationships. We have to ensure, not only from the state and the federal agencies, but from the regulated community, is how do we build that trust so that they feel more comfortable as we implement innovative approaches to compliance. Because if we don't build that trust and establish those relationships, there's going to be that question in the back of their mind, okay, what are they getting away with this time? And that always is a challenge to innovative approaches.
So I'm going to look out to this wonderful crowd. You all have been patiently and attentively watching, and I'm from now through the end of the program, which is at 3:30. Consider the floor open. If you come up to a microphone, we've got the ELI team, has Brett there, has a mic, and I think maybe Caitlin will too. Please chime in, and if you don't, we can keep going, because we did this on a conference call just to practice and went for an hour. So is there anyone who'd like to start the conversation? Yes, Frank.
Frank Friedman. I think any of us who've worked on environmental management programs over the years have worked and recognized that if you're managing primarily for compliance, you have a lousy management system. If the management system is integrated as part of the operations, compliance follows. One of the areas that makes the biggest difference, and some of the speakers have already talked about that, is risk management, particularly looking in terms of maintenance, preventive maintenance, predictive maintenance, management of change. I guess it'd be interesting to see what the corporate speakers have in terms of how they use those techniques in terms of their own operations, again, also as part of the culture, and from the regulator standpoint, in terms of how many of the issues that they face really are a result of lack of adequate preventive and predictive maintenance and management of change. In other words, when things are changing in an operation, it hasn't exactly been managed appropriately.
That's a great point, and please chime in. It makes me think about someone at a recent ECOS meeting who said, we're very big on how quickly we responded to the incident, and very quickly the public expectation is, why didn't you prevent it? You have all those sensors on your tracks. You have all this GIS mapping. Don't tell me how fast you got there to the spill. Tell me why you didn't know there was going to be a spill. So the risk management component, please.
Sure. I'll I agree with you completely that your comments about a management system being focused on the good results, not just compliance, and the role of risk management or risk analysis in a good environmental management system. I think that's extremely important. That's speaking from the perspective of environmental performance. The issue is, as a lawyer for a company with a very strong compliance policy, risk management just doesn't come into that. I mean, you can't risk manage compliance. You can't say, oh, well, this one, we have a low risk that anyone will ever find out, so we don't have to pay as much attention to that. Compliance is compliance, so you've got to stay focused on the whole suite of issues. That's why I talk about the 35,000 pages, because if you've got to comply with all of it and you've got to have a strong level of assurance of compliance, that's a lot of effort and a lot of detail. But again, I agree with you completely that if you're talking about managing environmental performance, that risk analysis is extremely important. It goes to some of your comments about the state level and focusing a regulated entity on where they can put the resources to reduce the most impact.
Janet or John?
I'll maybe just add on.
Yeah.
I would say the same thing. Part of a good management system is embedding good environmental and safety culture, pollution prevention. A lot of it is going from a very reactive approach to a proactive approach. If you're going to operate something till it breaks versus putting in diagnostics and doing condition-based maintenance systems, those are things that we don't call environmental, but they're all things that have environmental benefits. So that's part of running a good business, helps you with your environmental compliance and risk reduction.
Yeah, Janet.
We did a study a few years ago where we called companies in the S&P Global 100, and then we called companies in our business council, and we asked them about how they're managing the risks of climate change. And almost all of them talked about their enterprise risk management systems, but when you get to something that's changing, they weren't as good about, we're not factoring that in because we don't really understand. Not all. I mean, many were. But there were some who were like, we're struggling with how to actually fit that in there. So like DOE right now has this voluntary climate resilience partnership, and that's really a good effort to try to help companies think about the risks associated with climate change. So again, that's a public-private partnership, and that's a good way to actually build some credibility and build some knowledge and help folks actually figure things out.
So I think what you're saying is to incorporate a true risk management concept into this. You have to know what the risks are.
It
So
is.
I'm going to try the, the Don Rumsfeld, the known knowns, the unknowns, the things you know, the things you don't know. So in order to do it, you have to know what it is. So you're saying if you don't understand it, you can't manage to it.
And large companies, by and large, have way more capacity to figure this out, right? You have scientists, you have experts in the areas, but if you're a small to medium-sized company, that risk is pretty significant that you often don't have that kind of capability in-house. And that's where these public-private partnerships, I think, are really helpful. And voluntary programs, again, are really helpful for building capacity.
Martha and Todd?
Yeah, I guess my experience, I'll say our experience, my staff may have a different take on this, but is when there is an issue, it's either that you don't have a system or the system failed. I mean, it's pretty simple. I would say that most of the larger, all the larger companies are sophisticated, and they all have systems in place. And when something goes wrong, it's usually because of human failure. And it could be human failure in not recognizing that a piece of equipment needs to be upgraded or replaced, but it's basically human failure. And this gets back to one of my comments made at the very beginning of this session, is that you need to make sure that all levels of staff really appreciate the need to do what it takes to be in compliance, and that is part of their job. And then in the smaller companies, they, a lot of them either are hand to mouth, or they just don't have those kind of systems in place to look at all regulatory requirements, or they only look at the ones where somebody brought it to their attention, because they got caught or something happened. And so that's part of what we do is we do try to prioritize our programs, and so that the larger, more sophisticated companies, we pretty much assume that they know what they're doing, and we will try to focus our attention on the small and medium-sized companies, because they may not have the processes in place to actually, they don't even know what they're supposed to be doing. So we do try to help them out. But from my perspective, it's largely human errors that ends up being the issue for us.
And I'd say we have some similarities to Colorado, but clearly it's very evident when a business has adopted the culture of environmental protection. I would wholeheartedly agree with that. I don't know that I would go so far as to say that all the larger companies that we have in the state have maintained that culture. I think the culture is there, but sometimes for a variety of reasons that culture may erode over time, and those are when we run into really some serious issues. We do the same thing in terms of focusing on those that have a lesser ability to incorporate the programs, the medium and small companies. But when the big companies have a problem, it's a big problem. And so I would agree with your comment.
That's a good point. Great. See, right here in the front. Yes, ma'am. Yeah.
I'm Barbara Goldsmith. I find the conversation very interesting, and I'd like to throw a bit of a different perspective on it. The invisible versus the visible. I work in Europe a lot, and one of the big incentives for the Environmental Liability Directive, for example, is the emphasis on prevention. And we've had lots of discussions on, is the Environmental Liability Directive, just as one of the many directives of Europe, is that successful because you can line up all the cases that have been brought or not by the member states and judge it on that basis? Or is it, in fact, that the emphasis on prevention, which is incentivized in Europe and not well in the United States, brings a very different perspective and, in fact, is demonstrative of the success of the directive, and it is still nascent in its development, because it, in fact, emphasizes this. All companies do all these preventative activities, but particularly the large companies, but obviously the mid-size and the small too, they get almost no credit for that. There's no mechanism in the regulatory arena to give companies credit for that. So I would say that a system that would work better would be one that truly measures the invisible and gives some credit for that and incentivizes good behavior that would negate the need for regulations.
Right, so that is the ultimate question, right? Can private environmental governments completely replace, the traditional role of regulation? I think we started there, and I'm glad you've brought us back there, because it sounds like in the European system they may have some, I don't know if I'd want the title of environmental liability manager. It sounds like the shelf life of that job would be very short. But any of you have some thoughts, especially those of you who work in other countries, and rewarding the good behavior, the what did you call it, the invisible? Yeah. John.
So when I think about sustainable solutions, if you look at a more sustainable society, sustainable development, I think of sustainable freight development. It's not just looking at issues through an environmental lens. It's that environmental, social, and economic lens. And I know that EPA has commissioned a National Academy study on looking at, I think it was Lisa Jackson, focused on looking at altering the EPA mission to more of a sustainable solutions mission. If you were redesigning it from scratch and saying, those are the outcomes we wanted pollution prevention, we wanted less resources used, we wanted efficiencies, we wanted to address climate change. If you looked at all of those sustainable outcomes as the goal, I think you would potentially design a different regulatory system. So it may not be necessarily incentivizing, NERDA is the equivalent of Environmental Liability Directive here in the U.S. I'm not sure if you would come out in the same spot, but again, the way I described it, sustainable solutions, it's purposefully a win-win. I'm not necessarily looking for an agency to reward me for things that I'm doing because it's good business anyway. So anyway, that's kind of my initial thoughts about it's just how do we get to a more sustainable regulatory system that rewards sustainable solutions that balance social, economic, and environmental outcomes is maybe what I'm throwing out as a challenge.
Others?
It seems to me like this shifting a little bit more towards state focus. I mean, the states have a more ability, it seems to me like, to be able to kind of think about how we're going to take advantage of corporate good behavior than if you're just from the an EPA perspective. I mean, Todd, you've talked a little bit about if you do these things, maybe we'll not audit you quite so many times, and I think that's good from a corporate perspective. And Martha's mentioned several things like that as well. I think there's opportunities for states to do that more than just a federal bureaucracy. At least that's what I observe.
Martha.
So I'm going to put a big caveat on that. About 8-10 years ago, we tried to come up with our own EMS permit system and reward those companies who had good systems in place, who had been compliant and were going above and beyond, and found that because of the delegated nature of the programs, we were unable to offer the incentives that were desired by the companies because of the restrictions in the federal laws. We couldn't make the permits any longer than 5 years. We couldn't, there were requirements that had to be in the permits. There were minimum things that we had to do. And we couldn't, yeah, we might be able to do things like not monitor as much, but, from a perspective of what would provide the needed incentive for companies to pursue an EMS permit, they just we were not able to offer them what they were after because of the restrictive nature of the delegated programs.
The 35,000 pages.
Right.
Or to echo an earlier comment, it's requirements that once upon a time we thought were integral to achieving environmental performance, but technology, attitudes, environmental management systems, everything has gone beyond that, but now the need to check the boxes is preventing you from taking the next step.
And we know that there are some executive orders that the president has signed and some efforts to already, I know we've all been asked to submit regulations that are not as productive as we'd like them to be under the prior administration, lest one think this is only done by the Trump administration. It was also burdensome regulations that the Obama administration was collecting. ECO submitted on that. We are very good. I think if we combined our lists, we have a very extensive list, could total close to 35,000 pages of regulations that have been identified as problematic or not achieving the outcome that we want. But getting that system to change, rebuilding it from scratch, John, as you suggested, is wishful thinking, I think, on all of our part, but we're kind of tinkering around the edges. Any other comment? Todd?
Yeah, I'll just
And then,
add on to the
yeah.
previous statements about, state agencies having the capabilities. And as much as I hate to admit it, but the states are typically the last to adopt new innovations. So business is typically ahead of where the states are or have the capacity to go. And so we're reactive in a lot of ways to the innovations that are coming out of industry. Now, there's more we can do, I think, to find ways to have those discussions and see how we can integrate that faster. But right now, I think we are always lagging behind.
I would maybe just one comment. So I think ITRC is a wonderful organization that's, if you're not familiar with it, it's a state-led agency around remedial technologies, and it's a wonderful place for benchmarking. So I would say that's a great place of common ground. And I'll just, many states, just like industry, are taking on liabilities in terms of orphan sites, underground storage tank funds, O&M for Superfund sites. So I think there's a lot of common ground to be had among the regulated industry and states in that form. I think that's a great example of a partnership that works very well.
Thanks for the shout out to ITRC because it's housed at ECOS, so thank you very much. So we've got Jamie, we've got Jay, and then we have this lady up in the front. So we'll go in that order and we'll keep going. So
I've been thinking as you've been talking about how these sort of vague concepts get operationalized, and it seemed, speaking kind of broad brush anyway, historically in the environmental and occupational safety and health areas, we've historically done sort of voluntary opt-in programs. So VPP in the OSHA world, Project Excel and Performance Track and Sustainable, or Sector, whatever, the one that's being revived, sector strategies, and some of these have been studied, and there are a lot of literature about whether they're really very viable. There's also, in the securities world, where we've sort of basically allowed private entities to devise a consensus standard, GAP, and then we've delegated to a lot of the compliance job to these hired consultants, auditors, to sort of evaluate, and the SEC almost kind of manages by exception. And I guess that's happening with site cleanups, where states, I think in New Jersey, have been licensing private. Do you guys have I'm sort of stacking the deck, and I guess I don't mean to, but I'm curious in terms of how this would actually happen. Do you sort of see something from each column, or is one or the other of those approaches seem more promising?
I'm glad you brought up, we talked on our prep call about New Jersey's licensed site professional program, this concept that could some other party perform the service and then allow us to then more efficiently use the resources here. So please chime in. Richard?
So, yeah, in your one from each column, Jamie, I would say yes to that. If I'm going to take the column of all the numerous acronyms you ticked off, I would say the model I like best is TSA PRE. I would like to see a compliance program that's modeled on TSA PRE.
We talked about the fact that some states have what they call companies within the state they call them frequent flyers. and this is how we got to our airport analogy. There are companies that are well-known. They've operated in Wyoming for 100 years. They've been coming to you for permits, Martha or Todd, for X number of years. And can you treat those entities slightly differently, like a TSA pre, the people who come through the airport all the time, they know to take their shoes, leave them on, laptop, 3-ounce bottles, whatever. And we just put our resources on people who just might not know those things.
Right, and a key difference, you mentioned the 3-ounce bottles. So TSA doesn't say if you want to do pre, you have to use 1-ounce bottles. It's got to be beyond compliance. It's no, we trust you that you're actually using a 3-ounce bottle.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. So don't make it harder to be in that TSA pre-program.
Yeah.
Okay? Others that might want to chime in on this? All right. Well, we've got Jay in the back, and then the young lady up here in the front. And okay.
Gentleman in the back.
Good, this is good.
Thank you. So a lot of what you've been talking about has been oriented towards the large companies, both on the regulatory side, but also it seems to me possibly on the private environmental governance and the voluntary standards side. And I guess I want to ask the question of, whether the voluntary standards, private environmental governance, is a potential method of reaching the small and medium-sized enterprises. Because my experience, and I've been a proponent of the voluntary standards, particularly environmental management standards, but also greenhouse gas emissions, that they are things that reach large and maybe medium-sized, but not the small. Is it possible to extend this to the smaller?
I think that's for anyone here.
I'll
Janet?
just take one jump in, and not on the emission side, but on the resilience side. So this voluntary partnership that I mentioned, it's DOE's voluntary resilience partnership for the electricity sector. I believe I probably have the name wrong. Anyway, there's small companies and large companies in that. And that's a way for actually the large companies to actually mentor some of the small companies in terms of what's worked and actually how we sell it upper and to PUCs. I think it's been very helpful for the companies, both large and small.
Great. Martha? Yeah,
Just-
Martha and then Richard.
Just really quickly, that made me think of, we have an environmental leadership program in Colorado, and I think most states do have some kind of environmental leadership program where you're rewarding those environmental leaders who have, depending on the level that you've done a one-time thing that was really great, or you're consistently above average. I'll say that, but you're achieving things that are greater than, better than compliance, just in compliance. And one of the things that when we've surveyed the companies that are routinely in that program, one of the things that they have asked for is the ability to mentor other companies, which is really interesting to us. We didn't ask them to do this. They want to do this. And so that we have been pairing them up with smaller and medium-sized companies to help them with environmental issues that they may have. So I'll just throw that out there as something that's actually worked, that it has been and is working very well.
Well, I think we were talking beforehand that, it's sort of the one bad apple spoils the bushel, right? So for those leading companies, they want to, lift everyone up so that the entire sector is performing as best as possible. Anyone else want to comment on that?
I want to add one little thing
Sure.
to that. I think there's pretty good evidence that rewards matter. So giving somebody an award, a pat on the back, so then they go back up and talk to their senior management about, look what I got for this, look what I got for our company. I think that matters.
Yep. And I've heard that recognition by government, that is where it does matter. Recognition by your peers is important, but recognition by a regulator might just get a few extra points.
You'll hang that on your wall.
Richard?
Yeah, I'm blanking on the name of ACC's.
Responsible care?
Responsible care.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that you talked about sector. I think responsible care covers a pretty wide range of different size companies. So that would be an example of how you can go about diversifying the number of companies or the size of companies involved.
Todd, having seen all the mineral extraction work in Wyoming, do you have some small entities that can survive in that market, or is it mostly large?
Depending on which sector you're talking about, you've seen that on the mining side, it can be fairly large.
Yeah.
But on the oil and gas side of things, we run the gambit. And so you see during the boom times, you'll have 100-plus companies, but I would say probably the top 10 typically are the majority operators, and then the others are coming in, at a much smaller rate. In terms of, we do have a volunteer remediation program, which is helpful in terms of the liabilities that one might face, but you're still doing the same type of work that you would be doing if we were taking an enforcement action. It's just done under a different umbrella.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Great. Well, I know we're just about at time. We did promise this lady in the front. You get the last question. No pressure.
Thank you. I know, trying to make it a good one. My name is Christine Ng. I'm from Ramble and Byron. I work with a lot of companies that operate in multiple states, and one of the biggest challenges for them developing an environmental management system are all the varieties of regulations in different states and even in local jurisdictions, and many of them advocate for more harmonization across state regulations. I'm curious what your thoughts are, both from the regulatory side and from the business side about, now that we're looking at more state leadership on environmental regulations, how will that, how does industry continue advocating for some greater harmonization to make it easier for them to develop a corporate management system?
So I didn't plant that question, but I could have planted that question.
You could have. How many states do you operate in, did your bio say?
Well, 28 states.
Yeah.
So we own 25,500 miles of track and operate another 7,000 miles. So we're, if we're sending loads from Southern California to Chicago, for us, we're very mindful of the different systems among the states. It's a lot easier for us to have one set of rules rather than multiple sets of rules. And what it ends up forcing is sort of this lowest common denominator approach. So it gets very tricky. So it's not an easy thing to do when you're moving across. And we're not, telecommunications, energy, transportation, pipelines, there's a lot of interstate businesses, and I will say it's much easier. We're big advocates for us in those situations having a solid role for the federal government and a single set of rules. There are other areas where it's not as critical, where parts of the infrastructure aren't interstate, then a state system is much easier to manage. But you're right, that is a big challenge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in fact, in the ECOS Cooperative Federalism paper, the widely acknowledged role of the U.S. EPA is to set those minimum national standards because they are critical. But then, of course, states can go above and beyond. So maybe just to close this out, Martha and Todd, you all are neighbors, if I remember my map well enough. So to John's point, do you ever look to each other?
Never.
I was just going to say that we've been fortunate that Colorado follows the lead of Wyoming.
I mean, I think that's a really good question, because that, when we're advocating for flexibility so states can do things sort of on their own, that does create the issue potentially of now every state's doing their own thing, and therefore you've got 50 plus different requirements, that you might have to meet. I will say that I think all the states, I can't imagine this doesn't happen in every state. Whenever we're doing certainly statutory changes, but also regulatory, the question always comes up, what are the states around us doing? Mm-hmm. How does Wyoming and Utah, and what are they up to, and how do they regulate this? And so, then we try to figure it out. And frankly, the programs can be so very different, and it's not that, like our air program is like their air program, only we've got greater requirements or fewer requirements. It's that there's like apples and oranges. It can be really hard to try to figure out what is another state doing in a particular program, because their organization of their program is very different. So, but I mean, I think that's a really good question, and maybe what comes out of this, if we don't have the federal even playing field, or the mandate, and the states can do something different, is that this will force the states, maybe the companies, can go to the states and say, can you work this out so that we can have a common set of requirements across all the states, and here's what our proposal might be for that.
I was thinking it could be ECOS.
So I love a discussion that lands with more work for me and my colleagues. No, in all seriousness, I actually enjoy a discussion that leaves us wanting more, because I think we could keep going. And so that was a great last question, so you met the bar very well. And so we are going to thank this tremendous panel, hope that the conversation continues over coffee break, and that you come back for the discussion on cooperative federalism that starts at 4 o'clock with some other stars like Commissioner Bob Martineau, who I see in the back of the room. So look forward to seeing you all at 4 o'clock, and thank you for spending part of your afternoon with us, and thank you to this great panel. It was a lot of fun. Have a great afternoon, everyone.